Welcome to today's lecture. We are going to look at the aims, rationale, and scope of comparative education. Last time in the lecture, we said there is not one single definition of what comparative education is. Different scholars have indicated that one, for you to come up with a comprehensive and an inclusive description of what comparative education is, you have to put it in a context of sorts. It's not the same thing in one region as opposed to the other. So for you to come up with a comprehensive definition of what comparative education is, you need first of all to put it in a context, but they generally agree on a few things, including the content of what you're going to be comparing, including the how, the methodology you are going to be using to compare. Today, we want to dive into the aims, the rationale, and the scope of comparative education. So let's dive straight into it. So the first aim of comparative education is to, kind of give us a bird's eye view of global systems of education. What's going on in other regions, and how can it inform what we do at home? The second one will be, creating of a global database. You see, when you are comparing systems of education, you are in essence putting data together about systems of education in different regions. For instance, one person, be it as a project of postgraduate studies or as independent research, would look at a comparison between Kenya and Uganda, or Uganda and Tanzania. And then another person will be looking at, say, Western European countries. You'll be looking at France and Germany, or Scandinavian countries. You'll be looking at Norway, Finland, Denmark. Or in the East Asian tigers, you'll be looking at Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Singapore. All these put together make up for a very good database within which researchers can use to analyze systems of education and compare what works in one region as opposed to others. And if it's possible to borrow from one system certain elements that can inform practice in another. Another aim is to simply, explore how families and class and social factors shape schooling. Those are other external factors that shape education. How do these factors, these social factors, affect education? And like Michael Sadler would say, things outside school usually affect things inside school. For instance, a child coming from a poor background might, for the most part, be doomed to fail because they don't have enough resources, as compared to a child coming from a middle class or upper class family who has adequate resources, you see. And it becomes a lot easier for children of the rich to have good access to good education. And you see here, education becomes a tool that perpetuates income inequalities. The rich can have it better, and the poor might be doomed. But to all rules, of course, there are exceptions. There are children from very poor backgrounds whose motivation to work hard is simply because they want to run away from that poverty. So those become exceptions to those social rules. Another aim is to just understand what drives reforms. What are the factors that drives reforms, and what reforms are easily acceptable and then interwoven into the systems of education, and what remain constant. Sometimes you can think reforms are needed when they actually are going to have adverse effects. Not too long ago, Sweden decided to remove textbooks from their classes. The whole system decided to go tech. So there were tech service systems. But much later, they realized there is no replacement for a textbook. Just last year, they decided to bring back textbooks into the classrooms. So some things will always remain the same. And somebody said, the more things seem to change, the more they remain the same. So we are seeing a shift back to the textbook. And there's a very good reason why people would want to go back to the textbook and stop over relying on tech, for example. Another aim of comparative education is to try and improve our own system. I think I said in the first lecture that we don't do comparisons for the sake of comparison. Instead, we do comparisons for the simple reason that we want to try and improve what we have. Not that what we have doesn't work well. Maybe it's even serving us, well enough. But when you look at it from a global context, then you realize that no system is an island. We must relate with other systems. So some modicum of reform is necessary. I will give you an example. East Africa as a region has diverse systems of education. We don't have the same, similar but not the same. Take for instance, higher education. The Kenyan education system has social science degrees running for 4 years. Uganda and Tanzania have systems running for 3 years in social sciences. How easy is it for a Kenyan student in second year to go to Uganda and be in second year? Can a Kibabi University student move to Makerere University or Chambogo University and go straight to their respective academic year, join second year where you left from in Kibabi University? How would you compare that with students in Uganda and Tanzania? Uganda has 3 years of university, Tanzania has 3 years of university. Don't you think it becomes a lot easier for them to do cross-national exchanges? And indeed, we know for sure that even the Inter-University Council of East Africa has found it easy to support student mobility, moving between Tanzania and Uganda because of those similarities. So sometimes we want to do reforms to fit in. There was a point where Europe also had diverse systems, but because they wanted to unify, to make it easy for students and staff mobility, they had to harmonize and make degrees 3 years. So some of these reforms, you do a selective borrowing from systems where they work, and sometimes it's just for convenience. Now, you also want to look at it from the point of view of the learning process. You gain a broader understanding of how learning works in different countries when you look at it in a comparative lenses. For instance, do we have a system that is learner-centered elsewhere that is serving that system better than ours that is teacher-centered? And what does it mean to be learner-centered? Do we have the same parameters to say for it to be learner-centered, this or that has to happen? So one of the aims of comparative education is just, gaining a broader understanding of how learning works in different places. And then this looks like a mundane point or mundane idea or aim, but indeed comparative education can help broaden international collaboration. How? You see, sometimes when you want to study a system of education, it necessarily means you're going to collaborate with people from that system. And when you're collaborating with people in that system, you foster that friendship. And when you're fostering that friendship, you are relating with people from diverse cultural backgrounds. So you become cultural sensitive. You behave in a way that you not offend others. You become more tolerant to other people's cultures. And by doing so, you strengthen the international collaboration with these people whose system you are studying. So why study comparative education? What is the rationale of studying comparative education? Those have already been covered before, but then I'll quickly just scan through. Primarily, we study comparative education to enable us understand our own system. You see, when you dig deep into our system, inevitably you will do a comparative study, because it's easier for you to say our system was borrowed from Canada, for example. Our system is now being changed to reflect the European system or the American system. You will inevitably do a comparative study. Usually, when you do a comparative study, you're trying to fix something that you feel is less desirable in your system. At some point, the Kenyan education system was deemed to be very exam-oriented. So how do we make it a little more practical to reflect global trends? You look at systems where, practical knowledge is given primacy. Another reason is simply to know people from diverse backgrounds. How does Ghana run its system? To do that, you inevitably have to, say, travel to Ghana or collaborate with people from Ghana. So you just get the opportunity to know other people from those other different backgrounds. And then this has been said before, to improve education at home, you just want to make our own education better. People usually refer to Singapore as one of those countries whose economy in 1963, when Kenya was getting its independence, was, not as big as ours then. And then the question that begs is, what did Singapore do right that we got wrong from the get-go? And, many scholars have attributed the growth of the so-called East Asian tigers, that is Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. They have attributed their phenomenal growth, not just to, industrial development, but to education in its entirety, that there is a very important and crucial nexus between education participation rates and economic development. And so when you are trying to improve your system, you inevitably do a comparative analysis with systems that have similar national character, and then find out what works in such a context and what doesn't. Now, perhaps Michael Sadler put it so aptly. He says, and I quote, "In studying foreign systems of education, we should not forget that the things outside the school matter even more than the things inside the school, and govern and interpret the things inside." What does he mean in simple language? He means that, take for instance, socio-economic background of a learner and how it affects their academic achievement. Children from poor background might have it a little rough to achieve a lot academically. Because one, the fact that they don't have enough resources to support their learning. Two, there's a very big likelihood that their parents did not go to school, so they don't even have role models back at home. And three, the language at home might not be the language at school. So you are speaking one language at home, call it Kiswahili or vernacular, and at school you are supposed to be using English as a medium of instruction. So how does this child, fit in and use English as a language of learning? Compare that with a child from a rich background. The language at home is usually the language at school, and they have access to many instructional artifacts that support their learning. Even the things that you take for granted, for example, access to television. Some television stations use English as first language. I mean, they use native speakers of English, rather. And so they learn the best way to pronounce words, and they master the language early on in life. So this proficiency in the language of instruction, when you take that to the field of academia, you find them thriving a little more than children from the poor background. But like it's been said before, sometimes you have negative reinforcement that because these poor kids want to run away from that poverty, they then work hard, a lot hard, because they have a lot that is heaped against them. So there's always an exception to that rule, but exception it is. Now, another aim is to just, borrow international best practices. For example, what constitutes the appropriate or recommended class size, and how does the class size affect learning? I will tell you for sure, the smaller the class, the better. The teacher-student ratio is supposed to be low enough that you can afford individualized learning. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all approaches to learning, to teaching, because children or students don't understand at the same rate. But it's only possible to have this individualized learning if and when you are able to teach a small class. That is not usually the case in developing countries. We grapple with very large class sizes, and sometimes learning becomes impossible for some. Now, we also look at the teacher-learner relationships. Many countries have diverse teacher-learner relationships. In Kenya, for instance, the teacher is seen as an all-knowing, omniscient narrator, and therefore in typical Kenyan classes, the teacher talk time is a lot more than the student talk time. And therefore, to achieve a typical learner-centered approach is quite difficult, as opposed to small classes, say in Finland, where the learner rather is at the center of the lesson. Now, we also look at exposure to innovation. When you are involved in these cross-national comparative studies, you are exposed to innovation. I will pose a question. China and India have very large populations. They are not necessarily the richest countries in the world, but somehow they have to manage the big population. So how do they do it? China, for instance, employs technology to just make sure that every learner has equal access to education. Now, we also look at the economic implication of education. What is the economic implication of education? And it's been said by many researchers that there exists a very important nexus between education and economic development. And the often quoted example is the East Asian tigers, that is Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. These countries realized early on that there exists an important relationship between education, especially higher education participation rates, and economic development. You see, with the industrial growth, with increase in their export portfolio, they need manpower. Expatriate manpower is very expensive. So what did they do? They trained their own experts. And so they had a very big pool of trained human capital. The residual outcome of this big human resource was that they could depend on their own to drive the industrial growth in the country. And we know that is part of the reason why the economies grew very fast. Now, I will give you a quick comparison of the things we've been saying using practical examples. We do have students who have been to Norway, to NLR University College, and so far the feedback they've been giving us about the experience over there is a very interesting one and a positive one at that. The first two students, that is Silali and Millicent, went for the fall semester. They're back, and these are some of the photos out of that. In red is Faith. Faith is currently still in NLI University College for this fall semester. And Millicent is the one standing there. You see the level of student engagement in that classroom. In red, that is Faith working for a presentation that she's supposed to be making in that class. She told me that. The same as Millicent, while she was seated there, she was preparing to have a presentation, her time to teach. So student talk time is increased. You want to give students a lot of time to show you that they actually understand. And there is Millicent presenting her topic using PowerPoint. You know, that engagement is what that system values a lot, that you are self-directed. You are given tasks within in which you're supposed to perform and, you know, give results and give presentations, teach your fellow students what you've learned. And that individualized learning is what you might not really get in large classrooms, because how many times would you create classes for, say, 1,000 or even just 200 students to make presentations? It becomes virtually impossible. Another one would be the relationship between lecturers and students. In Scandinavian countries, the line between teachers and students is a bit blurred. You know, when people are in social gatherings, you wouldn't know who is a teacher and who is a student. So they also believe in lifelong learning. So you might find somebody who's a lot older than the average student, and they are students in the same class. You might find somebody who is a lot younger in that class, but when they're out there, there is that mutual respect. Now, that relationship between learners and lecturers aid learning in some ways, that the barriers are broken down, because that social barrier then becomes a hindrance in some system where the teacher is viewed as a semi-god and the learner is supposed to be submissive and just, you know, sit there to listen and to get everything that the teacher is saying and be a passive listener. That is unacceptable in some systems. What about the outdoor activities? Outdoor activities is actually valued in some of those systems. You know, there are group activities outside of the classroom where they have little dinners together, they have coffee together, they do hiking together, and that helps to cement that relationship. We also look at the level of infrastructure development. Every classroom equipped with PowerPoint presentations, small classes, everybody has personal space to work with. The auditoriums are well equipped, very comfortable, and learning becomes pure joy. Creating that is no doubt a very important aspect of education in those systems. As other systems are grappling with numbers and infrastructure, some systems have a lot better, and there is enough for all the students to be taken care of. Let's now move to the scope of comparative education. So what do we study? The scope just means what we study. There are 5 main perspectives. 1, study the subject matter, things to do with financing, curriculum, teacher education. How do you train your teachers? That forms the scope of comparative education. We also study the geographical units, you know, for example, regional systems. How do different regions run their systems? Is it tuition free or do they pay tuition? Is it government controlled or is it in the hands of the private sector? We also look at the ideological scope of comparative education, and how, for instance, social and economic ideologies shape the way we teach our learners. There are systems that believe in egalitarianism. For instance, the Norwegian system, a system I know well enough. Students, all school-going children, all school-going pupils must be given equal opportunity to the world's best education. And you find even in the remotest of areas in Norway, people having very good schools. So, because they believe in egalitarianism, the idea that we can all be equal, we can all access equal opportunity. We also look at the thematic scope, where we look at the issues, the problems of a system. For example, how is our educational participation rates? How do we deal with the drop-off rates? What are the points of wastages? Do we have a good level of graduation rates, or do we have wastages? So that is the thematic scope. And then finally, we have the historical scope, which generally looks at the development of comparative education from the traveler's tales to the present day. Let's turn our attention to the forms, or what you call the dimensions of comparative education. Now, there are four broad areas, or four broad dimensions of comparative education. The first one is comparative pedagogy. Every time you hear the word pedagogy, what should come into your head or in your mind should be teaching, or I should say teaching and learning. There's no teaching where there's no learning. So comparative pedagogies, where we simply, study classroom dynamics in different educational systems, how some systems value exams and how some systems value creativity. So we look at that in comparative pedagogy, classrooms dynamics. Is it individualized learning, or is it crowded classrooms that cannot give room for individualized learning? Now we also look at methods used. Do we use learner-centered methods of teaching, or are our methods very coercive? Somebody said it's difficult to learn from a teacher you fear. So when you instill fear, for instance, by administering corporal punishment, you make a learner fearful, and learning becomes almost impossible. You cannot teach a learner who is walking on eggshells, fearing to say anything in class for fear of punishment. Instead, you want to be more persuasive. So we also look at the methods that we use for teaching. Now, in intercultural analysis, we examine various forces that affect education. For example, culture. How does this society view the education of the girl child? Or is the girl child condemned to be married off early so that they bring wealth to the family? What is the size of the family? If you are many and you are struggling economically, you might not get the best out of education, because then you might be condemned to go to poor schools. What are the poverty levels or income levels? Poor children have it very rough. They struggle, and this affects their academic achievement. What is the political environment like in terms of policy, for instance? So the political issues in a country also affect education. For instance, the introduction of free education. Free education should be backed by resources. I mean, if you don't have enough resources, it becomes a lot difficult to have quality education. So you realize some of these policies are political declarations. We do them for political expediency. You wake up one day and say, when I become president, we will have free primary education, free secondary education, free university education. Question is, do we have anything in this world which is free? Somebody's got to pay for it. So this might turn into overtaxation to just support that heavy system where you're trying to create a socialist kind of system in a country that is grappling with poverty. Now we look at also development education. Development education. We look at the global bodies like the IMF, that is the International Monetary Fund. We look at the World Bank. We look at the United Nations. We look at the USA. These bodies guide policy. There was a time the World Bank introduced the so-called Structural Adjustment Program, where we were told that we are better off focusing on basic education as opposed to higher education, and so all our resources went to developing basic education, only to realize later that indeed there exists a very positive correlation between higher education participation rates and economic development. Higher education is what develops the human capital. And so it was much later that the World Bank had to come back and say, look here, I think you were wrong. You need to start focusing your attention to higher education, because indeed it's been proven beyond reasonable doubt that you are better off focusing on higher education and not on basic education. So just do a balanced way of doing things, so that these people coming down there from basic education can transition into higher education, because this is what will form the bulk of your manpower. We have come to the end of this lecture, and in this lecture we looked at the aims of comparative education, and we said it aims at creating a global view of education. It helps in developing an educational database on a global scale. It helps us to understand factors that drive reforms in systems of education. It also helps us to institute educational reforms to improve our own system. And finally, it helps in fostering cooperation among nations. We have also looked at the rationale of studying comparative education and said studying comparative education helps us to understand our own system. It helps us to understand other systems. It also helps us to improve our own systems. We can borrow international best practices, and we expose our own people to innovation, besides understanding the nexus between education and economic development. We've also looked at the scope of comparative education, that is to say what we study. And we have said there are 5 perspectives. 1 is the subject matter, 2 is geographical scope, 3 ideological scope, 4 thematic scope, and 5 historical scope. We have also looked at the 4 broad areas under which comparative education is divided, and we've said these include 1, comparative pedagogy, 2, intercultural analysis, and 3, international education, and 4, development education. Thank you all for your attention. Until next time, it's goodbye for me.